Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we are unpacking an ancient text that presents us with a deeply paradoxical historical mystery. We're looking at the book of 2 Chronicles, and specifically, a message that is so unexpectedly dark, it completely changes how we view history and human nature.
Okay, so let's dive right into this bizarre contradiction. I want you to just picture the scene for a second. King Solomon has just wrapped up this monumental 7-year building project. The magnificent temple in Jerusalem is finally finished. Literally a dream his father David spent decades preparing for. This is it, the absolute peak of Israel's golden age. The whole nation is gathered, everyone is celebrating this glorious achievement. And yet, right in the middle of this triumphant dedication, Solomon stands up and offers a remarkably dark prayer. He actually starts visualizing his people's total destruction and exile. You really have to ask yourself, why on earth would a wise king focus on a catastrophic hypothetical disaster on the absolute happiest day of his reign?
Well, let's explore that in Part 1, The Unexpected Prayer and its 7 Petitions.
So the text from chapter 6 tells us that the glory of God filled this newly built temple so overwhelmingly that the priests couldn't even perform their duties. It's just a moment of pure, unadulterated awe. And in response to this, Solomon begins a massive, detailed prayer spanning from verse 14 all the way to 42. Notice the progression of his requests listed here. The first 6 points cover standard, albeit serious, national crises. We're talking resolving personal disputes, military defeats, droughts, famines, prayers of foreigners, which, by the way, is incredibly inclusive for that time, and seeking a blessing before going to war. Standard kingly stuff, right? But then, we hit the 7th petition. And it completely changes the tone from just managing present crises to forecasting a total apocalyptic national collapse.
I mean, look at the grim reality of this verse. When they sin against you, and you give them over to the enemy, who takes them captive to a land far away or near. Just remember the context here. The party is in full swing, the architecture is gleaming, and Solomon is standing there essentially saying, God, when we inevitably mess up so badly that our enemies conquer us and drag us away as prisoners to a foreign land, please listen to us then. It feels completely out of place. It's honestly like giving a wedding toast and talking about the inevitability of divorce.
Which brings us to Section 2, the real audience, after the exile.
To solve this mystery, we really have to play detective for a minute. We need to step back from Solomon's timeline and uncover exactly who the book of Chronicles was actually written for. Because this book isn't just some dry historical log, it was a targeted message written for a very specific, deeply traumatized group of people. Look at this timeline to see their actual reality. Hundreds of years after Solomon's glorious reign, his dark, hypothetical prayer actually happened. The Babylonians absolutely destroyed Jerusalem. For over 50 years, the Israelites lived as captives in Babylon. Finally, eventually, they were allowed to return. But imagine the shock. They didn't return to Solomon's golden city. They returned to a city completely in ashes. The royal palaces were rubble, the walls were burnt down, and that magnificent temple completely gone.
You can imagine the absolute despair of these returned exiles. Chronicles wasn't ancient history to this audience. It was the painful real-time explanation of their own reality. Standing there in the rubble, they were asking these agonizing questions. Why did this happen to us? Where's our history going? Has God completely abandoned us? Do we have any future left? When this specific audience read Solomon's prayer, it wasn't a futuristic hypothetical to them at all. It was a mirror reflecting their deepest, rawest pain.
And that leads us to Section 3, the true root cause and finding an honest interpretation. Look, if you are going to rebuild from absolute literal zero, you can't rely on comfortable lives. You have to know exactly why the foundation crumbled in the first place, right? And Solomon diagnoses that root cause right in verse 36, for there is no one who does not sin. This is a stark, painfully honest declaration of human nature. Solomon is clarifying here that their future exile wasn't going to be a military failure. They wouldn't be defeated simply because Babylon had better chariots or stronger soldiers. No, they would be defeated as a direct result of their own spiritual failure and sin. They brought it upon themselves.
Now, I know what you're thinking. To an already broken, traumatized people, hearing, hey, this was all your fault, might sound like a cruel condemnation. But actually, it is the exact opposite. An honest diagnosis is the absolute starting point of recovery. Think about it like this. If you are treating a severe, life-threatening illness, a doctor who lies to you just to spare your feelings isn't actually helping you at all. You can't begin to heal until you make an honest, painful diagnosis of the root cause. By acknowledging their spiritual failure rather than just blaming Babylonian politics, they were finally holding the cure right in their hands.
Let's move on to Section 4,
Shuv, the meaning of turning, and the return of the heart. Let's see how this builds into the ultimate prescription God gives for their dire spiritual condition. What's truly fascinating about verses 37 and 38 is the specific condition God lays out for their restoration. It isn't about physically moving back to the city of Jerusalem. It's not about gathering bricks and rebuilding the city walls. The text specifically says they must come to their senses while still in the land of their captors. The physical return of the city is entirely secondary to the spiritual return of the heart.
And this brilliantly illustrates the Hebrew concept of shuv. In Hebrew, this is the central word for repentance. But listen, it doesn't mean just feeling kind of guilty or slightly altering your thoughts. Shuv means a complete 180-degree change in the direction of your life. It means taking the gaze you had fixed on the world, forcefully tearing it away, and completely turning it toward God.
So we can break down the action of shuv into these 3 clear steps. First, you have to stop and achieve that really honest realization of your condition, even while you're still stuck in your exile. Second, you turn entirely away from the distractions and the destruction of the world. And third, you actively walk toward God with, as Solomon says, all your heart and mind. It is an incredibly active, all-consuming process. It's not just some half-hearted apology, it is a total rewiring of your life's trajectory.
Now, Solomon tells the future exiles to pray toward the temple. But wait a minute, remember our timeline. By the time they are in exile, the physical temple is just a pile of smoking rubble. So clearly, facing the temple isn't about bowing down to a physical structure made of stone and cedar. It means focusing entirely on God's presence and God's promise, completely regardless of where you physically are. It's about opening the window of your heart toward the divine, much like the practice of stepping into morning prayer today to orient your entire day.
Bringing this all to the present day, we hit section 5, our spiritual exile today and the unfinished battle.
We really need to bridge the gap between this ancient returning community and our modern daily lives. Because guys, this isn't just an ancient history lesson. In verse 39, Solomon hits the absolute climax of his petition, hear from heaven and forgive your people. And historically speaking, God did exactly that. He miraculously answered this prayer by moving the heart of King Cyrus of Persia to physically free the Israelites and let them go home. But here is the massive tragedy. Getting out of Babylon absolutely did not mean getting Babylon out of them. Their struggles were far from over.
Look at this divide on the screen. On the left, sure, their physical exile to Babylon was officially over. But over on the right, their spiritual exile continued right at home in Jerusalem. Rebuilding the city was incredibly hard work. They faced fierce opposition, stalled construction, and severe poverty. And under all that pressure, they quickly slipped right back into resentment, selfishness, and sin. Their bodies were free, but their hearts were right back in captivity.
And honestly, this is exactly where the mirror turns toward us. Even if we consider ourselves spiritually freed, how often do we find ourselves trapped in modern forms of Babylon? We get held captive by crushing financial struggles, fearsome illnesses, deep-seated hatred for others, or just that endless, frustrating cycle of repeating the exact same sins we swore we'd stop doing. We live in profound despair, physically free, sure, but functioning entirely as spiritual exiles in our own lives. But guess what? The solution remains exactly the same as it was thousands of years ago. Shuv, a complete turning. The physical temple of Solomon is long gone. Even the later, more magnificent temple built by Herod was eventually destroyed. But for those watching who follow the Christian faith, the narrative points to Jesus Christ as the eternal, true temple. He is the presence of God that can literally never be torn down. And our call is to direct our complete turning, our entire heart toward Him, no matter what kind of rubble we currently find ourselves standing in.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. I want you to look really closely at your own life right now. Are you physically free but spiritually captive? What spiritual Babylon are you currently trapped in today? And honestly, more importantly, are you ready to stop, turn completely around, and direct your entire heart toward the true temple? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into 2 Chronicles, and I really hope this leaves you with something profound to think about today.